Wow, okay. You've kind of bigged me up so much, I don't want to let you down now. I'm not a professional speaker or anything, so what I typically do is just, as you can see, is just tell you my story, what I've done in the past, the rise and fall, and hopefully the rise again. And there will be bits that you can connect with and hopefully some tips that I can give you along the way. One thing that I always do is run out of business cards and then not have contact details to hand out to people. So perhaps I'll just tell you how to get in contact with me now and then talk through stuff. So it's easy to find me. I'm on facebook.com/Martin Skinner, twitter.com/Martin Skinner. The websites for the investor side of things for us are inspiredassets.com, and for the consumer product where we're selling our apartments, inspiredhomes.uk.com. Might be worth having a look actually while I'm talking as well, so you can see what we do and how we do it there. So I was a typical student, I would say, coming to London, moving up from the south coast where I wasn't born, but I grew up. I was born in the Solomon Islands. Both my parents were teachers. My mum was a frustrated entrepreneur, I would say, and my dad was very much a very smart sort of do-gooding civil servant, if you like. So when I came up to London, it was really a taste of freedom. I'd always been quite entrepreneurial, though, when I was growing up. I did a paper round, didn't just do a paper round. I bought a load of gobstoppers for 25p each and then carried them round on my paper round and sold them at school for 50p each. Little things like that I've done from a very early age, but I would say that entrepreneurial skills are something that are learnt rather than something that you're born with. And certainly my approach to business has been one of stubborn persistence, probably being the most critical success factor along my path. Stubbornly refusing to give up when things go wrong, as opposed to intellect or particular talent for anything. So I came up to London to study IT and a bit of sport, because I like playing sport and I like playing computer games. All of the sport stuff was a bit too scientific for me, so I ended up swapping to business and computing. Did my degree, went out, having done a few extra little qualifications over the summer at one point, went out as an IT guy setting up servers for a company that built websites for small businesses. After about 6 months there, I got a bit frustrated. They didn't want to pay me very much, and I thought that the product was a bit too inflexible. So I set up my own little web design business almost immediately after finishing university. Ran that for a year, sold it to a bigger IT company based in Canary Wharf, and moved out to East London from where I'd been at university in southwest London, to run the combination of an existing software development division in a bigger IT business, merged with my little web design business. Got some very useful experience actually working for a very experienced businessman on how a bigger business would be run properly and how they modelled all of their cash flow forecasts and that sort of thing. But found it quite frustrating being told what to do after having tasted the freedom of running my own business. And one thing that I'd really wanted to do when I came up to London, well, first of all, I guess there was the shock of having to pay rent when I'd been living for free at home. And because I'd always worked and earned bits of extra money, I'd always had a reasonable amount of money to buy the latest toy. Suddenly I had to pay rent, and all that money was money that I wanted to spend making my car go faster. It was gone, and every month it was gone. Very frustrating. So I'd looked at how other people rented. I actually had a very good deal on a little tiny bedsit in Wimbledon Village. I think I was paying £250 a month, which sounds ridiculous now. It was 20 years ago, but it was a good deal. And still I didn't like it at all. So I'd looked at whether I could either rent a bigger flat and sublet the rooms in it, and therefore not have to pay the rent myself, or ideally buy a place and rent out the rooms, not have to pay anything, and have an appreciating asset. Now I had an income, I found a property, but I needed a guarantor, and my lovely entrepreneurial mum was happy to guarantee my mortgage. My dad threatened to divorce my mum and move out if my mum guaranteed the mortgage. Spent his whole life paying off the family mortgage, so he wasn't going to jump back into that for his crazy entrepreneurial son. So I had to wait. But after I'd sold my little web design business, not for very much money, but I had a salary, suddenly I was able to buy. But along the same train of thought, I didn't want to just swap rent for a mortgage and buy a one-bedroom flat. I went and bought a 3-bedroom terrace townhouse further out in the far reaches of Royal Docks, North Woolwich, really. And I knocked the kitchen into the dining room to open plan that as a kitchen diner living space. And in the first instance, that freed up the old living room to be a 4th bedroom. And I lived in one room, and I rented out the 3 spare rooms, and that paid the mortgage, and it gave me about £500 a month after all bills as profit each month. And I'd been reading Rich Dad Poor Dad and Cash Flow Quadrant and these sorts of things. Well, great. I was earning about £4,000 a month, a bit less than that actually, from my salaried full-time job, which was really hard work. And I figured, well, I'm not going to live in each one of these houses, so the next one will make me £1,000 a month. So 5 of those and I'm sorted. Free man. And that is what I did, but I'll step back a little bit, if you don't mind. Having been a consumer guy, having built websites for small businesses typically, and having looked to simplify the consumer process whenever they came to a website to generate a better outcome for the customer and the business owner. I wasn't a property guy, my family isn't a property family. So I had taken the same consumer approach to property and just simple logic. Technology for me has always been about efficiency. So I just looked to apply that to what I see as a relatively inefficient business or industry. So the first thing I did was look at what consumers could afford to pay. And in 2002, when I bought my first house, I think it was about, I lost this fucking document, but I'm sure it was about 95% of the working population of London in 2002 could afford about £500 a month for their housing costs. Now, then, and even more so now, clearly, nothing that was being produced that was new was therefore affordable to the mainstream of the market, the vast majority. And in fact, same, but not to quite the same degree, applied to the second-hand market. You couldn't rent a one-bedroom flat, even in cheap parts of the Docklands, for £500 a month, including bills and service charge if you were buying. So it seemed to me there was an obvious huge opportunity in producing something that the market could afford and doing it to a good standard, providing good customer service. So, you know, I didn't specifically plan to rent all of my rooms out for £500 a month, but that was the typical rental price for one of my rooms. I always looked to get the most rent I could get, but it was more than a coincidence to me that each room did let for about £500 a month. I reckon that figure now is about £850 a month, by the way, which is either £500 inflated by 14 years, or if you break it back from a typical salary in London, which, depending on which type of average you use is somewhere between 40 and 50,000 pounds a year. And then the amount that most people allocate towards it as a percentage, I think it's about I can't remember exactly, about a third of their gross income anyway. Still comes back to most people can afford about £850 a month. And if you look at house prices in London, well, an average, both new and second-hand home is about 550,000 in London. New build, a one bed, on average, whole of Greater London, is about £650,000. Two bed is over £1 million now for an average in Greater London two-bed flat. I haven't worked out what the mortgage would be on something like that, but it's an awful lot more than £850 a month. You've got to worry about service charges and utility bills as well. So clearly there's a huge gap in the market for something that people can afford. And although people can't afford what's typically produced at the moment, my experience is that consumers' expectations of service standards and product standards has not reduced. We live in a consumer culture, so expectations have increased quite significantly. So my solution was just to produce something, simplest way to do it would be to produce something that is a smaller private space and maybe, ideally, have a form of shared space as well. So it's a more efficient way of providing that housing or accommodation solution. So I built up my little buy-to-let portfolio by buying one, remortgaging it, buying the next one, remortgaging that one, buying the next one. And then friends and family were asking me just about the time that I replaced my salary and was looking to leave the day job. They asked me if I could help them to build up similar high-yield portfolios. So I set up a little management business, sourcing, letting, managing and maintaining what I call professional house share accommodation. So I did that, and I hired people to do the things that I didn't really want to specialise in myself, like lettings, management, maintenance, and the refurb, the complicated stuff, basically. I just like buying things. And I liked the extra cash flow that it gave me at the end of the month. And I quite liked, planning out the customer stuff as well. I really enjoyed that bit. So I built a little management platform. September 2003, I set up the management business. And I think it was about 2006, we'd got about 300 rooms under management. I hired a guy that used to work for me at the IT company to come in. He was very good at the practical side of things, and his family did have a history in property. So he kind of took care of the delivery side of the projects, and I ran the kind of customer and investor side of things. But after 3 years of this, we really weren't making very much money from the fee business. We were making very good money from our individual portfolios, both on a cash flow basis and on a capital gain basis as we added value through buying well, refurbishing and adding value, extending and adding more value, and then house price inflation. And I sat down, decided, well, I don't think the management business is a very efficient use of my time, because I'm spending so much time on the business with salaried employees' problems and sorting out their problems, and I'm spending all my time sorting out problems with properties that aren't actually my properties. And actually, I was always putting my customers' properties first. So if there was a void period, it wasn't in a private client's portfolio, it was in my place, because I didn't want to have to explain to anyone why they had a room empty. So that's not a very efficient use of my time. We weren't making very much money on that business, yet it was taking up all the time. So I debated whether I just drop the management business and just focus on my own portfolio. But my conclusion was I could only recycle the capital so quickly, so it wouldn't have taken up all of my time. I had spare time. And I didn't think that people were providing a management service, certainly for room lets, very professionally anywhere in the market. And if I dropped that, then I would end up having to do everything myself. And I didn't want to fall into what I considered to be a sort of amateur landlord trap of not really working the assets as hard as I could, just because it was hard work to do so, but it made financial sense too. So I decided, right, actually I want to keep the management business, but I need to make it work more efficiently for me financially. I had a great solution to the low yield that residential typically produces, but historically, residential generates 70% of its total return from the capital, not the income. So right, I need to have a share of the capital side of the equation, not just a commission on the rental. And I didn't think that buy-to-let investors would be willing to give me a share in the profit on the individual houses. So I'd been reading the property and financial press for quite a few years by then. Things like, by the way, the things I sort of read were initially Property Investor News, and I've always read Property Investor News. I think it's a great publication. Richard Bowser's awesome. His leader column, something that I've read for years and years and years, every edition. I also read the Sunday Times business section every Sunday. As I became more experienced and had a bigger portfolio, I started reading a magazine called Property Week, which is very good, and particular economists. So I follow people like David Smith, who writes in the Sunday Times business section. He writes in Show House magazine. So having read the slightly more commercial property press, like Property Week, for a while, most bigger transactions in property were done either through funds or joint ventures with funds. And typically, there was a profit share there as well as fees. So I thought, buy-to-let's not really going to earn me a profit share, but if I either set up my own fund or a joint venture with a fund, then I should be able to get a profit share. We've got a great model, why wouldn't someone invest in it? I decided I didn't really know anything about funds, so maybe that would be a step too far then. So a joint venture with an existing fund made more sense. I'd always analysed every individual property purchase or potential purchase with an Excel spreadsheet appraisal, and I cash flowed the returns over typically 5 years. So the jump to a fund model wasn't overly complicated. Instead of it just being based on one property, I just added a row for how many properties I bought over time. And then I got someone who was really good at spreadsheets to add an IRR calculator, which is how the language that most of the funds seem to use. IRR stands for internal rate of return, by the way. It's an equivalent to an interest rate, but it adjusts based on the time value of money. I won't explain it any more than that, if you don't mind. But it's not rocket science, but the little algorithm behind it is quite complicated, so I got someone else to do that. And then I put together a little PowerPoint presentation just showing what we had done to date, what we were in the process of doing, and what we were looking to do, and then taking some of the key financial figures and also talking about the consumer market that we focused on, young professionals, and talking about the areas that we were focusing on, so well-connected areas that would be benefiting from regeneration and gentrification. And then I got 3 investor groups round, kind of pitched to them in my flat, took them out for a little tour to show them property that we'd done, property that we were doing, and a property that we were looking to buy. And I was pitching for 2.5 million of equity. This is kind of the most surprising part for this whole process for me was, I'd been selling websites for anywhere up from £500 to typically 5,000. The biggest one I sold was 250,000 with my own business. That was a huge project for me. And then 3 years later, I was pitching for £2.5 million. The biggest objection that I got, basically all three groups really liked what we were doing. But the big problem was that one group said, look, we're 16 people, we have 150 million of equity to invest by the end of this year. We have 500 million of new equity coming in January. We have 3 billion of assets under management. We just can't do joint ventures for £2.5 million. It's not enough money. Okay, wasn't expecting that to be the problem. A lot of money to me, but thank you very much for coming. Speak soon. And I went and sat down, thought about it. I'm an IT guy, solve problems. Problem is £2.5 million's not enough money. Potential solution, we'll buy more houses. So I just edited the spreadsheet where it said how many houses we were buying, multiplied it by 10, tweaked it a little bit, called them back half an hour later and said, yeah, absolutely right, we need 30 million. And they said, great. It wasn't quite that simple. Then, of course, we went through 9 months of painful due diligence. Some guy who probably wasn't much younger than me, but he came out and estimated. Basically, they offered to pay £1 million for a quarter of the operating company, as well as doing a joint venture for 30 million quid with us. And I didn't really want to sell shares in the operating company. It was kind of a freedom thing for me. But they offered £1 million, and it felt like we needed to do that part. That was for a quarter of the business. Felt like we kind of needed to do that deal in order to do the joint venture. And then they sent out a guy from BDO Stoy Hayward to work out the value of the business. Well, year one we turned over, and he got his spreadsheet and PowerPoint presentation, start working through the questions. Sorry, Microsoft Word template. Well, first year we turned over £2,500. It was the first month of managing one property. Second year we turned over £50,000 and made about £5,000 profit on it. Third year we were about to turn over, forecast about 500,000, and profit would have been something like 50,000. So after 6 months of going through all of this stuff, he came back to me and he said, look, I'm going to have real difficulty valuing your business at £4 million. And we were growing very fast. I was kind of like, well, yeah, if you value it on a traditional basis, I can see why you'd say that. But I didn't want to sell shares anyway. It's worth what someone wants to pay for it. They offered the money. I didn't tell them. I don't want to sell it for less than £1 million for a quarter. So you can write whatever you like in your little Microsoft Word template. And he obviously then went back, and they came back and tried to chip the price to buy shares in the company. To which I said, well, look, we didn't want to sell shares anyway. We both want to do the joint venture, so why don't we bin the whole share investment thing and we just get on and stop messing around and do the joint venture? And that's what we did. So over the course of the next 12 months, we bought about we developed about £180 million worth of property. So we went from buying maybe one house a month for private clients and ourselves to, in 6 months, we jumped up to buying 25 houses a month. And we went from renting about 5 new rooms each month to renting about 250 new rooms each month. Now, even up until that point, before we got started with that, we'd kind of outgrown our office before we'd fully occupied it each time. So you can imagine some of the challenges that you face when you go through 10 times growth each year. We couldn't find an office to rent that had enough car parking spaces for all the lettings cars, IKEA vans, maintenance vans. So to solve that particular problem, I found an industrial estate in Peckham that I bought, and I redeveloped it from an 18,000 square foot horrible old rundown industrial block with a big car park to a beautiful 22,000 square foot sort of little mini Googleplex in Peckham. I'd kind of considered us to be half tech and half property. Yeah, it was a very cool office, and we had enough car parking spaces. And it cost a lot less to pay the mortgage on that than it did to rent something smaller that was less suitable. Now, by that time, we were about 9 months into this joint venture. We'd signed it, I think, in 2006. And we were due to get a second tranche of 100 million of equity, and we were looking to scale it up to a £1 billion portfolio, maybe convert to a REIT, and then bring in larger scale institutional investors. But we started having a few difficulties with our first investor. They weren't really interested in the detail, having done the deal with us. You know, they kind of bought shopping centres and huge office blocks and small countries and things. And so having a look through 25 individual house purchases in Canada Water for sort of £300,000 or £400,000 maximum each, they weren't really interested in that. And at the same time, I was very focused on the consumer, the young professional, and I felt that, you know, they would be potentially looking to move to places like New York, other major capital cities. So I was very keen to see if we could expand at least around London, rather than just the Docklands that we were focused on. And these guys just weren't really. Same time, I got introduced to a chap that ran a hedge fund. He was very interested in the operational model, the consumer side of things. And he wanted to do another joint venture with me outside the original territory of the first joint venture. And he offered me 8 million equity a month to go out and make more acquisitions and to start building to rent. And he offered me £7.5 million for a quarter of the operating company. So I was kind of like, told you. And we did that deal, sold a quarter of the OpCo for £7.5 million in 2007. And we started building, we bought some little sites to build 6 or 8 flats on. Unfortunately, the timing of doing that deal and the credit crunch kind of came together quite closely. And I think in the process I managed to upset the ego of the main guy that ran our first JV partner. So when Bear Stearns went down, our first JV partner basically stopped paying. And they were sending across, all of the properties were bought offshore, so they had control of the properties, and we were paid commissions for sourcing, we were paid a project management fee, but all of the money for the builds went through us. So we hired all of the contractors, either in-house or as small design and build teams. And we had the personnel for doing the lettings, management and maintenance. We only got those commissions once the properties were done and let. So we didn't have a great deal of working capital. We'd grown very fast. So when they just stopped paying, and they didn't say they're not going to pay, they said, we'll pay you next week. I ran out of working capital in a week. We were spending about £1.5 million a month. You can imagine 100 individual houses under redevelopment at any one time, 4 or 5 people on each site, plus materials. So I was in trouble after just a week. Despite having sold a quarter of the business for 7.5 million, I bought some properties with that, and the extra money I put into the hedge fund that had bought into us. I didn't need the money, and they were the only business that I'd come across that was growing faster than us. So I then had to kind of go back to my second investor and say, look, I've got a problem. We're going to run out of cash to pay salaries and contractors. You've just invested in us. I'm going to have to lay off 70, 80% of the workforce. Thought I'd better let you know. And he said, look, don't do that. That's jumping the gun. Just keep delivering the assets. We've got lots of cash. We've got a billion in the fund. So we're all friends. Just lend you the money, and together we'll get the first JV guys paying again, and off we go. Basically, he'd invested on the basis of a price to earnings multiple, and he didn't want the business to shrink and therefore his investment value to reduce. Whereas I didn't want to sack all of my friends that I'd hired. So that was a great relief. And I borrowed the money and kept carrying on. It took 3 months to get the first JV partner to start paying again. And in that time, I borrowed £4.6 million. And when Lehman Brothers went, my second JV partner, open-ended funds, investors pulled their money out, and suddenly they called in the loan to me with 24 hours notice. So it was kind of a zero to hero to zero in record time. I lost everything, went bust, and had to start again. I've just been given a 10-minute warning, and we've only just started. So I'm going to try and rush through a little bit, hopefully to some other things that will be useful for you. So I started up again. I set up a little fund in a joint venture with a friendly competitor of mine who started at a similar time, similar background, IT guy. But rather than doing a big joint venture, he set up a little unregulated collective investment scheme fund. So I set up his second fund with him because none of his investors took money out. He kept getting paid, he was fine. So I like the diverse investor base as opposed to one big JV partner who may not pay. So I set up the Urban Share Opportunity Fund with Richard, an urban share. And the plan was to raise 10 million quickly, small sum of money, and then we'd go and do a series of bigger ones. But because although it was an unregulated collective investment scheme, both sides of the equation are regulated. The distribution, so raising the money, and managing the money once it's raised. So we had to promote it through IFAs, who post-credit crunch were very nervous. And I've always been very direct and said, I've gone bust. Basically doing exactly the same thing I was looking to raise money in a distressed market for. And residential still astonishes me today, but the biggest asset class in the UK is considered an alternative asset, which puts it into the highest risk categories for all traditional sort of fund structures. So raising the 10 million in 6 months and then going off and doing more funds became a distant possibility. It took 18 months to raise £750,000, and that's probably mostly because a friend of mine put in 400,000. Raising funds is a pain in the arse. It's really hard work. But we did manage to raise enough money to close it, to invest. We bought some houses. They performed very well. We got to about 1.5 million. It's still running today, but it was too small to build a business from. So at the same time, I'd been helping my then fiance, now wife, to build up a little lettings business, which was really hard work. I had 2,500 tenants, my peak with Nice Group, and yet getting a little lettings business working and profitable took years. It was really hard work. So anyone that gets a small business up and running, well, whether it's small or large, it's really hard work. Well done. So got that up and running, and then my now wife kind of said, look, you've got all these grand plans, but we found out we were having a child as well, just when I was going bust. So she did give me a lot of rope, and then she said, look, you've got to find a way to make some money. So having not wanted to touch anything to do with stuff before, I didn't want to take any risks with doing anything wrong in the process of going bust. I did end up going back and negotiating with my trustee in bankruptcy, who wasn't just scary because it was a scary process, but he was also a black belt ninja. I kind of got my now wife to do most of the negotiating, actually. And we negotiated to buy back a chunk of my old personal portfolio. I bought back about 10 houses with mortgages in place. So I paid a premium over the value of the property because the values, they'd been geared to sort of 85%, they dropped by 15%, so there wasn't any value there. I paid a premium based on the surplus income to buy them back. Mortgages stayed intact. That was great. The surplus income paid the basic bills for the three of us, but it didn't give me any money to invest. So I ended up offering the tenants a discount in return for paying rent in advance. That gave me a little bit of money that I used to buy slide 2. With 2 minutes left. This little flat in Bow at auction, which was 150,000. We spent £25,000 doing it up very nicely. We turned it into a 1-bed. We then let it and refinanced it, I think at 275,000. We bought a 1-bed in Peckham for 89,000 at auction, spent 25 again. Remortgaged it again at about 275,000. A 1-bed in Garrett Lane, bought for 140,000, turned it into a 3-bed. So this is kind of a common theme, adding bedrooms adds a lot of value. I may not get any further than this. So, they were big margin projects and they were really quite simple. So with this one, for example, it was a 1-bed with its own separate kitchen with its own window. I took the kitchen, put it in the living room, and we had 2 windows in the original living room. So very simply, put a bedroom in the old kitchen, and I split off a 3rd bedroom in the living room. We remortgaged, despite everything that could have gone wrong in the project going wrong. There's a big hole in one of the roofs, and it cost 45,000 instead of 20,000 to do. But we paid 140 for it. We remortgaged it for 375,000. And we got a 14% gross yield on it as 3 separate room lets. So we kind of built the buy-to-let portfolio back up that way. Then we started doing office to residential. There is a bit of a story behind this. I'd been buying little units at auction. I didn't think investors would really want to back me on bigger stuff, having gone bust relatively recently. And the whole thing had just made me quite nervous about going out and the stress of raising money. But people then started offering me money to go and do joint ventures on projects. So a typical structure that I did was a 10 and 50. So the investor would get a 10% per annum return with preference shares. And then we would split the remaining profits 50-50 with an A and B share structure. So A shares had 50% profits, B shares had 50% profits. We would own typically, well, we'd own one or the other. The investor would own the other. And they would get, that return would get paid out at the end of the project after the preference shares had paid out. So we bought a little mixed high street block in Limehouse at auction, hairdressers on the basement, ground and first floor, and then the owner living above the shop in a non-self-contained flat. So the government then relaxed its rules around permitted development rights. So you could create 2 flats above a shop without requiring planning. Now, each of the floor plates on the first and second floor was 30 square metres. Now, because I'd always been very good at, had a lot of practice at maxing the bedrooms and the units, I got 2 two-bedroom flats in there. So roughly 29 square metres for each 2-bed flat. And when we got them valued, normally you would have only been able to do a studio flat on both floors. When I got them valued, they valued at just under £1,000 a square foot, which in 2012 was about twice the local market for good quality new build apartments. And this was still above a derelict shop at the wrong end of the commercial road. So I looked at why that might be. Am I okay to carry on for a little bit, by the way, do you think? Yeah? Is that all right? Part 2. Yeah. Yeah, so we were making good money on the project anyway. And I kind of looked at why did we get twice the pound per square foot? We would have made good money at the normal pound per square foot. And at that point, I concluded that it's the same underlying affordability driver. The flats were about 300,000 each. 300 to 325 they valued at. Now, most apartments from traditional developers, well, all of them actually, subject to space standards. So rather than my 30 square metre 2-beds, they would be 55 square metres upwards for a 1-bed. Now, they would start at a bare minimum of about 350,000 upwards. Now, based on the same salary, let's say 50,000 generously for a typical salary in London, a 5 times multiple of that is about 250. Now that means that if someone's going to pay 350,000, which is the cheapest one, they've got to have £100,000 of cash. To buy the average priced 1-bed, 650, well, that's 400 grand. That's a lot of money. I don't know anyone that didn't inherit money or sell a business that's ever been able to get their hands on that much money or save it. People don't have the discipline. So it's a very small fraction of the population that have inherited enough money or sold a business by the time they're 40 to do that. So my apartment, let's say 300,000, would be £50,000. So it's half or less the amount of actual hard equity that you'd need. Plus, the bigger flat will have higher service charges and higher utility bills, even if the same borrowing cost, which would typically take it way beyond the £850 a month. So I concluded that with our smaller flats, we were just slotting into that nice space where no one else was providing a product. And the vast majority of the market was capped at being able to buy at. So we had far more buyers and no competition. Great. And we scaled that up through the office to residential model. When the government relaxed the rules around that, we were able to scale it. Did a series of projects. We've got 5 in Croydon, which is about 600 apartments now. We've got 1 in Epsom, 1 in Sutton, 1 in Chertsey. We've built a brand around it. I could talk an awful lot more about this, but I should probably let you guys go. We're issuing bonds. We've created shared spaces. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll just talk about that a little bit. With a lot of the rent-to-rent model, which has really sprung up since I got into property and even since I lost the business, that really does illustrate just how stretched the market is. That people don't, I was kind of new to a degree when I was renting out rooms in houses. Now people are renting houses and subletting the rooms because the arbitrage, the difference between the two is so significant. One thing that often happens there is that the old living room gets rented anyway, so there isn't a living room. Now I always created an open plan, albeit small, kitchen, diner, living space. And over time we tuned the model and we analysed everything because we had quite a bit of scale. And my conclusion was that if you don't have to have a living room, people are so desperate to rent something that's half decent, that's affordable, they will sacrifice that. But if they do, if you don't provide that, the lowest common denominator for that customer is 1, because they don't really get to know their housemates, they don't really care about the rest of the house or their housemates. If they get a better deal somewhere else, they're off. Whereas if you created a communal space that was just about big enough to accommodate either all of them or a decent number of them, they would tend to become friends. They would tend to take more responsibility for the property. They'd feel responsible to each other, and they'd build a bit of a social network in there. They'd make friends, and they'd go out and enjoy London together. Then if they wanted to move, capitalist driver was the lowest common denominator would be 5 or 6. It's a bit like herding cats at the best of times. They'd all have different preferences, and they generally wouldn't move. Provide a good service, they'd stay. And we've created this on a slightly larger scale with our developments where we can accommodate it. It's not essential. So I will generally only build it in if there are spaces that I can't monetize with apartments. At Green Dragon House, we put a sky garden up there because we couldn't get penthouses on the taller block. And we put a club lounge on the ground floor where we had a big floor plate on the first floor. We had a big floor plate and apartments already around the outside, so it was just a wasted space. I typically spec it, everything that we do, to a noticeably higher standard than other providers, but I'm always very conscious of the running costs because it comes into that affordability equation. If you put a swimming pool, a gym, a cinema into these blocks, where maybe you've got a maximum of 200 apartments, well, how does that work relative to other specialist providers that have tens of thousands of members, and frankly, they struggle to make much money. So how does it make economic sense to have that in a scheme for 200? I don't think it does. It just means that the service charge is unsustainably high, doesn't get maintained. People go and use the professional gym anyway. But the space that we do provide, we kit out beautifully. Often with things that I've applied my obsessive compulsive purchasing disorder to on eBay and Gumtree. I always prefer to put something that's much better in, but buy it opportunistically. So maybe a useful tip is I quite often go around high-end furniture shops and I'll look for the really nice stuff and I'll make notes of the brands and then I'll go and see if I can buy them for 10% of the price on eBay and Gumtree. And that means that we can put in really nice stuff. So we've got Pininfarina chairs, they design Ferraris, in our block in Croydon. Normally it's 30 grand's worth of chairs. They were still quite expensive, but they were £3,500. Nice pool table, table tennis table, air hockey. This is another of our schemes, Impact House. And I'll rush through the rest. So we're issuing bonds, we're creating our own little crowdfunding platform, and it's been very kind of you to come and see me speak. Thank you very much.